like to invite Wendy and Lee Michael back up. And we're going to try something a little bit different here. We're going to bring the house lights up a little bit and drop this spotlight down a little bit so we have a more one-to-one relationship with the room. So if you want to ask a question, somebody's going to run to you with a microphone. So since I feel really bad that Larry was cut off last time, I wonder if you have a question that pertains to this, but other issues. So let's let Larry start off. Thank you.
Is it okay if I sit, or should I stand, or what?
You can do whatever you want.
Okay, I'll just be comfortable. I've got a lot of questions, but I'm not going to take all the time, so I'll try to figure out which ones. First off, I'd like to say that Wendy's presentation was a welcome bit of surprise, because here is a government who actually consults with the public and in a meaningful way and is concerned about neighborhood compatibility. That's something that we have at the least a difficult time with in this city. But Lee Michael, when you have I'm really interested in your software, by the way, because of its ability possibly to bring the public into a meaningful consultation with the city. How do you prevent data mining from a software setup like this? Because in certain circumstances, there are some things in the city of Vancouver, and I'm not sure whether they're privately sponsored or not, but they're used by the city of Vancouver for input from the citizens. And quite often, in my experience, it's been that you put your input in, and then you start getting promotional materials from the governing party. And so there's a problem with that in any kind of data gathering thing. Another thing is digital tools are usually one-to-one instead of, there's a lot of, I think, value in citizens meeting together in groups, in large groups, because a lot of times, I know, again, in my experience, when I'm in a meeting, I can hear somebody else asking a question, and either the question kicks me into another gear to follow up with another one, or the comment and answer to that question stimulates further thoughts. So digital media is good for dispersing information and things and keeping people up to date. I'm wondering how it works in a group situation. Also, when you're gathering opinions, who's framing the questions, and exactly what are you collecting when you get when you draw your results. And I'll try to be really hurry. Wayne, Vancouver at present has a design studio, but I don't think it's as influential as it was 20 years ago due to some change in governmental structure, I think. There's more of a top-down management style in the present government, and it makes it difficult for the design studio to have as much power as it might have in the past. Do you see that as a problem? And why does co-op housing necessarily need to build a path towards ownership? That's enough.
Do you want me to address your questions first? Or? Sure. So as for the preventing data mining, for us specifically, and I'm not sure about the Vancouver context, but you're mentioning that you receive, spam or other things from taking your information. For us, we just want to be the platform for urban planning and development, and it's all completely open source. That's the whole goal. And so we have authentication. That's one piece of it, right? Which is users are authenticated, and in the use terms, we don't have any problems with people receiving spam or anything like that. That's not what we're there for. We're there for free open source, find out all the information, open planning development, which goes in conjunction with advancing a open data standard for urban planning development applications. So we're not in the business of kind of we're just facilitating a platform and a space for accessing information in a simple way. So you don't have to worry about receiving spam through that, because you can be an anonymous user, but the point is when you begin to comment or vote on it, then you authenticate yourself through Google or however mode you choose. And this issue with the one-to-one relationship, for us, we're not advocating to replace existing processes. In fact, we want to work with design charrette workshops and participatory planning workshops to enhance that. So just to give you an example, in a design charrette for, let's say, a laneway or a coach house, we want to be part of that process from the beginning to develop a new methodology of that engagement in that actual environment where there are many stakeholders involved in person, but also give the opportunity to reach a larger demographic of people that may or may not be able to come to those meetings, because a lot of them, particularly in Ottawa, will be held during work hours, which makes it completely inaccessible for people to provide their input or feedback. And at the same time, digital tools can help increase interactivity. So things like a site plan. I went to a consultation before I came here this week, and they had about 6 site plans laid out, and the older ones and the newer ones, and people were just commenting, and you could see that the city planner's assistant was trying to write down all those comments. And for this way, by having a digital tool, they can pin the map, and those comments are there, and they can be followed up on, and you know that you made those points and that the city planner actually received them. So that kind of adds that sort of element to enhancing the existing in-person consultation. And as for the results, that's a larger technical discussion we can take offline just for the sake of time, but part of that is to allow for the most valuable public sentiment to rise to the top. So similarly, like Stack Exchange or Reddit, I think that there's a real value in allowing people to foster that conversation and see sort of what kind of, let's say, trusted community members are there. You can like their comments, you can vote on people's comments. That's one piece about it. And the other piece is who frames the questions. Well, if you're working with a client, let's say an organization that's revitalizing laneways, they, of course, could ask questions to people. So if someone says, oh, I don't like this, well, we would obviously want to find out, well, why don't you like this? Is it because of this, this, and this? I think the importance is to drill down into the details of why people may not necessarily like specific aspects of a project. So help refine what their opinions are. And finally, yeah, I think there's real value in sort of opening up a space for just a conversation in a transparent way. So yeah, that would be my question. We could totally have a discussion after about it.
Thanks. I'm going to start with the second question first, and that's just around the design studio in Vancouver. And I actually have to say that I don't have a deep knowledge of the situation with the design studio in Vancouver, so I wouldn't really be in a position to comment on that. With regard to the path towards home ownership with co-ops, I think it's a good question. I do think that there is a limited amount of co-op housing in the city, and in order to make that housing available to more folks coming in, that if there are folks that are moving towards the ability to be able to have the next stage and go to home ownership, that it would be good if there was actually product available in the city. I find so often what happens with folks that I know, and I grew up in Vancouver, so I've got a lot of cousins and friends and family here. They have to leave the city. There's a certain point at which, if you're moving from a rental situation, you either have to go real small or you have to leave the city. And it would be nice to have situations where there was the ability for folks that have families to stay in the city and to build that equity. And there's all sorts of studies that talk about building that equity and what it means in terms of building personal wealth for families. I mean, that stuff I think is pretty clear. And I think we generally agree upon that point.
I have a question
thanks.
here.
One more. Who has a question out there? Yes.
Hello. Hi. Thank you for giving your presentations. So I'm Amelia. Hello. So inclusiveness and social sustainability, I feel we can all agree, is one of the tenets to good urban design. In your experiences, be it in Breda, Ottawa, or Dallas, for neighborhood consulting processes, what would you use as a measurement of social approval or social license? At what point, in your opinion, do you think that consent is given? And in conjunction with that question, I think that the new developments in citizen engagement are fantastic and helpful for the democratization of planning processes and new apps. I'm curious though, how are vulnerable populations, or rather those with barriers to accessing information and technology, how can they be better informed and engaged on new civic interaction? At what point is public engagement sufficient?
That's a fantastic question, and one that through this whole process of building this tool that my team and I struggles with constantly, and I think that that's always something to keep in mind as it goes along. But in terms of measuring success, I think that to be able to see that people can access information in a simple way and be able to determine how they want to participate, I think that's the first step. The second step to that is that as for the barriers, already these barriers exist. So in this actual experiment, if you could call it a participatory democratic experiment, is that we're trying to break down those barriers. So take, for instance, the City of Ottawa's website. It's completely inaccessible for anyone. It doesn't conform to any web accessibility standards or contemporary guidelines. So that means people that are marginalized or they're not able to access that. And even if you go to the library, it's very challenging them to be able to access those services. So I think that part of this is that we're trying to open up that horizon and make it more accessible to people with a tool that can be more simple. And so that functions as kind of a civic education part to it as well. That's a huge component. So by connecting with other groups that already have best practices of civic engagement and such as design workshops and things like that, that helps kind of develop a methodology. So it's not just about the tool. It actually functions as a very civic education platform, if you will, the whole process of it. So, and the success, the citizens are what are going to measure the success. I think that's part of the aspect of it. So I don't measure the success. People measure it. So yeah.
In terms of when consent is given, I'm not entirely sure that in the situation of what's happening in Dallas that consent has actually been given, or that it's even required by the city. I do think that the measure of this over time, and I'm maybe speaking more from a progressive Dallasite perspective rather than some of the other groups that are there, that success would be a situation where you move away from extreme enclavism, where you have Latinos in one area of town, blacks in another area of town, and whites in another area of town, to a more mixed environment. But then also that you build things in the future towards not just mixing racial groups, but also making sure that there's mixtures of socioeconomics among those groups. So it's not just folks from different races living together, but it's also making sure that there's mixing of potential for economic engagement.
Okay, do we have one more question? A quick one.
Thank you. My name is Kian Goff from Northeastern University. Questions for Wendy. Super interesting cases. And I have two questions about this that you can just answer one or the other. On one hand, it seems like it's a liberalizing of urban governance in the context of a country that's always been very strong state-led, right? And I was wondering what the practitioners, the community of planning and design architecture, landscape architecture, what you or they feel about the long-term proposition of loosening the control of the state in that context. I mean, for many in the US, it would be like, oh no, that's what you do well. Like, why would you follow more market models? Second is how those propositions that you talked about, how they might work in cities that may not be the same size, might be larger, like a Rotterdam or Amsterdam, with more potential socioeconomic race and class tension than might exist in Ada or Breda. Thanks.
The private sector really welcomes it, that they can really be a part of the designing and planning process, and really it's more about the conversation they have with each other. Before the crisis, you had the municipality who regulates everything and the private sector, and they were opposed to each other. And now you see that they really start a conversation about the value they add, and what the civil society thinks about it. So it's more open, more transparent, and it seems to work. But we really had an incentive, like the crisis. It didn't work anymore. So before the developers could deal with the massive and complex amount of regulations, but during the crisis, it just didn't work. So they now starting a conversation with each other and then figuring out along the way how to deal with regulation. And but it's the first step of acknowledging that there has to be, you have to reshape and rethink your system. So both the municipality and the private sector welcomes it. And what I say, there are still parts that are strictly regulated in the city, but there are also more parts in the city that they can just step back and see what the developers propose. I forgot your second question.
How might it work in places with potentially more race and class contestation?
I don't think what you notice is that the civil society who wants to speak out in the public engagement process will come, and other classes won't participate in the public engagement process. I find it a hard question.
Colleague of Wendy, I think the social classes you're talking about, you should know that in the Netherlands we have a very far evolved system of social housing, meaning 40% of our housing stock is social housing. And most people who live there have neighborhood representatives representing them. So if there would be a challenge where they have to speak up and they wouldn't do it themselves, they would have representatives doing it for them, or people inviting them in to contribute to those discussions. So I think we are privileged in that sense that we have a whole structured system of getting the take of those people in on these projects, right?
Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you to the panelists. And don't go away yet. I have a couple of announcements. First of all, when you leave this room, and this is why I don't want you to rush away, there'll be some things to eat out there as well as some things to drink. We want you all, of course, to stick around for the activity that is after a fairly lengthy break. So that'll give us a chance to mingle and imbibe out on the beautiful corridor out there. And then when we reconvene here at 5:30, we'll have a panel, and we'll be joined by a lot of other people who will fill up some of these empty chairs. And that panel will be called "The 21st Century is Not Where It Used to Be. The Former Suburb Becomes the Global City." It's part of the theme that we have in this forum, where we're looking at not just the center city and perhaps the periphery, or where most of the people live now, as a condition for urban design. And I'm really pleased that many of the discussions so far have brought that point again to the forefront, that urban design is most aptly applied in places where people are humble rather than wealthy these days for a variety of reasons. We have some people from outside of our region who've come specially for this. Juan Wei and Bruce Pickering from the Asia Society. They're now in the room, and they have experience around the whole Pacific Rim. in their Pacific Cities Sustainability Initiative, which will bring a global perspective, or at least a Pacific Rim perspective, to this question. Also associated with their efforts, but a person of status quite separate from that, is Uwe Brandes. He's the Executive Director of Urban and Regional Planning Program at Georgetown University. Not simply an academic, many years with the ULI, which is in the minds of many the opposite of academic. From the city of Surrey, we have, with our focus on Surrey, we have Don Limas, who's manager of City of Surrey Community Planning and Department, and he's in the audience right now. We also have the architect who worked on many projects in the city of Surrey and in Surrey City Center, particularly the new tower that is going up, which will rival in its prestige and power to impress many of our own Vancouver projects. And then finally, Anita Huberman, who is the CEO of Surrey Board of Trade and also a second-generation Indo-Canadian. Worth emphasizing at this point that the massive waves of immigration into our region are not arriving here in the city of Vancouver, but rather going to what were considered peripheral cities in the past. But I think that that designation no longer completely applies. So that'll start shortly after we get a chance to fill our stomachs a little bit and to drink a few drinks and talk to each other. So thank you. See you all reassembled here very soon.